real stories of werewolves, of Dogman history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories.
Dogman versus Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I want to tell you about the one time I saw cryptids. It was two big muscular dogmen back in the 80s going at it in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. The first thing I noticed was how wrong their movements were, like someone had taken a wolf's body and stretched it up onto human legs. I sat frozen behind my steering wheel, watching as two massive shapes circled each other in front of the abandoned gas station, their breath creating clouds of steam in the cold night air. One was covered in thick gray fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight, while the other was brown, its muscles rippling beneath its coat like steel cables. The gray one made a move, lunging forward with impossible speed. Its jaws snapped shut on empty air as the brown one twisted away with a grace that shouldn't have been possible for something that big. They were both easily 8 feet tall when standing upright, which they did often, dropping back to all fours only to circle or to dodge. The brown one retaliated with a swipe of claws that could have gutted a bear, catching the gray one across the shoulder. The sound it made in response, well, I'll never forget that sound. It wasn't a wolf's howl or a dog's bark. It was something deeper, angrier, almost human in its rage. I watched them slam together like freight trains rolling across the cracked concrete of the gas station's lot. The gray one's claws left deep furrows in the pavement as it fought for purchase. The brown one had it pinned for a moment, but then they were both up again, circling, their eyes reflecting the dim light, like yellow coins. I should have been terrified. And I was, God knows I was, but there was something mesmerizing about their movement, something that spoke to a part of my brain far older than rational thought. This was the kind of thing our ancestors must have witnessed from the safety of their caves, the kind of thing that gave birth to our oldest legends. The way these creatures fought wasn't just animal violence. There was intelligence behind it, strategy in the way they feinted and countered. The brown one suddenly reared up to its full height, letting out a roar that shook my car windows and made my teeth ache. The gray one answered in kind, and I realized I was watching something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. Looking back now, I should have listened more carefully to my Uncle Jack's stories about these woods. Earlier that same day, as my gas gauge had started its steady decline toward empty, I'd actually been thinking about him, about all those Sunday dinners where he'd lean back in his chair after dessert and start in about the little people who he said lived in these hills. Uncle Jack swore up and down that there were intelligent creatures out here in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Not just animals, but thinking beings that kept to themselves unless disturbed. We all thought he was just making up stories, trying to spook us kids with tales about the gnomes and the forest spirits. You don't mess with them, he'd say, jabbing his fork in the air for emphasis, and they won't mess with you. But they're there all right, watching. They're waiting. They're as smart as you and me, but they're wild. Wild in a way that we used to be, before we forgot what it meant to live in the dark woods. I was remembering those words as I watched my fuel gauge drop lower and lower on that lonely stretch of road. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if I hadn't been so worried about running out of gas. My map showed a small town somewhere ahead, but distances can be deceptive in this part of Pennsylvania, where the roads wind through hills like tangled string, and what looks like a short drive can take hours. It wasn't even supposed to be a difficult trip, just a quick drive to visit my sister in Erie. But I gotten turned around somewhere after Pittsburgh, taking a wrong turn trying to avoid construction, and now I found myself on back roads that probably hadn't changed much since my uncle's day. The trees pressed close to the road on both sides, their branches reaching over like grasping fingers. and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from those dense shadows. "You're letting Uncle Jack get to you," I muttered to myself, checking the gas gauge again. "Next thing you know, you'll be seeing those gnomes he was always talking about." I forced myself to laugh, but it sounded hollow in the quiet of my car. The radio had given up trying to find a signal about an hour ago, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the growing darkness. I hadn't been up this way in a few years, not since Uncle Jack's funeral back in 1982. He'd lived out here most of his life, knew these roads like the back of his hand. Said he liked being close to the wilderness, even if it did mean dealing with what he called the old ways. Those things that lived deep in the woods and preferred to be left alone. We all thought he was just a crazy old man with too much imagination and too much time on his hands. Now, as the shadows lengthened and my gas tank emptied, I wasn't so sure. The first sign of hope came in the form of a weather-beaten sign promising gas and food in 5 miles. My car made it about 4.5 of those miles before the engine started to sputter. I nursed it as far as I could, taking my foot off the gas and coasting whenever possible, but eventually it gave up completely, rolling to a stop on the shoulder of the road. Through the trees ahead, I could just make out what looked like the promised gas station. I sat there for a moment listening to the engine tick as it cooled, trying to convince myself that this wasn't as bad as it seemed. The dashboard clock read 8:42 p.m., its red numbers seeming unnaturally bright in the glowing darkness. I clicked on my hazard lights and got ready to leave the car. But then I took another look at the station and my heart sank. The place was clearly abandoned, had been for years by the look of it. The windows were boarded up, though some of the boards had rotted and fallen away. The price sign still stood, advertising gas at 30 cents a gallon, a ghost of far better times. Nature was slowly reclaiming the concrete, with weeds pushing up through the cracks in the pavement and vines crawling up the station's walls. I sat there in my car, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. No cell phones to call for help in those days. Those were something out of science fiction in 1987. No houses in sight, just woods on all sides. The nearest town could be miles away. I had no idea which direction to start walking. Something rustled in the undergrowth behind the station. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but Uncle Jack's stories kept creeping back into my mind. The woods felt alive in a way I'd never noticed before, full of movements just at the edge of vision. The wind picked up, carrying with it a scent that made my nose wrinkle. Something wild and musky, like wet dog, but stronger, more primal. Every shadow seemed to be moving. Every broken branch sounded like a gunshot. Even sitting in the driver's seat of my car, I was breathing hard, though I was trying to tell myself that it was all in my mind. I locked the doors and I double-checked to make sure they were locked. The hazard lights blinked steadily, creating a rhythm that should have been comforting, but somehow made everything feel more surreal. That's when I saw the first real movement. Not just shadows and imagination, but something large shifting in the darkness near the station. At first I thought it was a bear, and that was frightening enough. But then, it stood up, and kept standing up, until it was far taller than any bear could be. Its gray fur caught the moonlight as it moved with a speed that seemed impossible for its size. I sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, as a second shape emerged from the other side of the station, this one brown and even more muscular than the first. I watched, paralyzed, as they began their confrontation, and everything I thought I knew about the world started to unravel. I've seen my share of nature documentaries, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. These two creatures, these two dog-headed men, began circling each other like prize fighters in some fever dream boxing match. The gray one kept making these short, sharp, huffing sounds, while the brown one remained eerily silent, just watching, with those glowing eyes. The moonlight caught their movements, casting strange shadows across the cracked pavement of the abandoned station. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. They started boxing. I mean, actually boxing. Standing upright on their hind legs like something out of a cartoon, except there was nothing funny about it. Their massive paws came up in front of their elongated faces, and they started throwing jabs at each other like they were at Madison Square Garden, instead of an abandoned gas station in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. The silver one was quicker, landing these lightning-fast strikes that seemed to irritate more than hurt its opponent. But the brown one, that thing was built like a brick wall. Every time it connected, you could hear the impact echo through the trees. Their paws would clash together, creating this horrible sound of claws scraping against claws, like knives being sharpened. The really unsettling part came when they started grabbing at each other's paws. The brown one managed to catch both of the silver one's front paws in its massive grip. That's when things got weird. Well, it got weirder. It might have been biting at them, but honestly I couldn't tell for sure in the darkness. What I do remember clear as day was the silver one's reaction. It let out this sound that wasn't quite a howl, and wasn't quite a scream. Something that made every hair on my body stand on end. There was this whole dominance display going on that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. The brown one was definitely stronger, and it seemed to know it. It kept trying to force the silver one down, not just with brute strength, but with these strange head movements, like it was trying to stare its opponent into submission. The silver one would bare its teeth, and my goodness, those teeth gleamed in the moonlight like rows of daggers. But it would also make these almost submissive, whimpering sounds before suddenly lashing out again with renewed fury. They weren't just fighting. They were communicating in some primitive yet complex way that I couldn't begin to understand. Sometimes they would freeze mid-battle, locked in these intense staring contests that felt more meaningful than the actual physical combat. The brown one would make these deep rumbling sounds that vibrated through my car, and the silver one would respond with higher-pitched yowls that sounded almost desperate. The brutality of their battle was made worse by these moments of almost human-like behavior. When they would grapple, it looked like some horrific parody of a wrestling match, their massive forms casting monstrous shadows in the moonlight. The brown one seemed to be winning, using its superior strength to wear down its opponent. But the silver one had this desperate energy that kept the fight going. I remember thinking, in that sort of detached way you think when your brain is trying to process something impossible, that Uncle Jack's stories about intelligent creatures in these woods had barely scratched the surface. These weren't just animals. There was something else going on here, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world. The way they fought, the way they moved, the way they seemed to sort of weirdly understand each other. It was like watching something ancient, something that existed in the space between our world and whatever wild reality lurked in the depths of these Pennsylvania woods. Every time I thought one of them would finally give up, the fight would intensify again. The silver one's fur was matted, but it kept fighting. The brown one's breathing had become ragged and heavy, but it wouldn't back down. They were locked in this primitive dance of violence and dominance, and I was their only audience, trapped in my car, praying that they wouldn't notice me. But then, everything changed in an instant. Whoop! The short, sharp chirp of a police siren cut through the night like a knife, and the effect was instantaneous. Both creatures' heads snapped toward the sound, their eyes reflecting red in the sudden flash of emergency lights. The brown one dropped to all fours first, moving with shocking speed for something so large. The silver one hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and I swear this is true. It looked directly into my eyes, before it too vanished into the darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. The police cruiser pulled up behind me, its lights painting everything in alternating washes of red and blue. In my rearview mirror, I could see 2 officers getting out, their flashlight beams sweeping across the area. One of them approached my window, and I had to remind myself to breathe. How do you even begin to explain what I had just witnessed? Would they think I was drunk? Would they think I was high? Would they think I was just another city boy spooked by the dark Pennsylvania woods? I rolled down my window, trying to keep my voice steady. "Evening, officer." "Everything all right here, sir?" The cop was young, probably not much older than me. His flashlight beam mercifully pointed at the ground instead of my face. "Saw your hazards from up the road." 100 possible responses raced through my mind. I could tell them about the 2 creatures. I could try to explain the impossible thing I had just witnessed. But even as I opened my mouth to speak, I knew how it would sound. 2 8-foot-tall dogmen having a boxing match in front of an abandoned gas station. I'd be spending the night in a cell, no question. Instead, I told them I ran out of gas, gesturing weakly toward the old station. I was hoping that place would be open, but the second officer had walked up to join his partner. "I don't even know when that place was last open," he said, and he was older than the first, with the weary voice of someone who'd seen it all, or at least thought he had. "Nearest working station's about 7 miles back the way you came." "Would you," I swallowed hard, glancing toward the darkness where the creatures had disappeared, "would you mind giving me a ride to get some gas? I really appreciate not having to walk it, in the dark." Something in my voice must have caught their attention. The younger cop's flashlight beam swept across the old station, and then into the woods beyond. "You see something out there that spooked you, sir?" I gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching those tree shadows for any sign of movement. I told them, "You know how your mind plays tricks on you in the dark? I just really appreciate the ride, if you could spare the time." They shared a look I couldn't quite interpret. The older cop nodded slowly. "Yeah, we can do that. First, let me check your license and registration." As he walked back to his vehicle to run my information, I kept scanning the darkness beyond the police lights. Every shadow seemed to hide something waiting to emerge. Every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. The younger cop must have noticed my unease. "You know," he said quietly, "we do get a lot of strange calls out here. People see all sorts of things in these woods at night." I looked at him sharply, but his face gave nothing away. Before I could say anything, his partner returned with my documents. "Everything checks out. Let's get you some gas." The gas transfer was quick and wordless, both officers keeping watch until I had my tank filled and my engine running. Then they left me alone, and I drove home. That was 37 years ago, and I've never really told this story to too many people until now. Sometimes I drive past that stretch of Pennsylvania woods, usually during daylight hours, and I'll catch myself scanning the tree line. The old gas station was torn down in the 90s, but that patch of land has never been developed. Maybe for good reason. My Uncle Jack passed away convinced that most people weren't ready to know what really lives in those hills. The older I get, the more I understand why he felt that way. There's something almost sacred about carrying a secret like this, knowing that beneath the veneer of our civilized world, there are still mysteries that defy explanation. Those creatures weren't just animals, and they weren't human either. They existed in some in-between world that most of us spend our whole lives pretending isn't there. I think about their boxing match sometimes, how strangely human yet utterly alien it was. It reminds me that we don't really know everything about this world, not by a long shot. Every time I see a nature documentary or hear about some new scientific discovery, I think about those glowing eyes in the darkness, about that moment when the silver one looked right at me before disappearing into the night. Some nights when the moon is bright and the wind moves through the trees just right, I can almost convince myself it was all a dream, but then I'll catch a hint of a musky wild scent on the breeze, or I'll hear something that sounds almost like those huffing breaths, and I'll remember. There are still places in this world where the old ways live on, where creatures we can't explain carry out their ancient rituals just beyond the reach of our understanding. And maybe, just maybe, that's the way it should be. on Donner, on Blitzen, on Dasher and Prancer, and also tonight's EP, who's named the Zoomancer. Please join me in thanking the Zoomancer for making this episode possible. The Zoomancer is one of our channel members, and that means he gets to see our secret uncensored members-only episodes, like the one we dropped this week. For more information about all this, here's our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank?
Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.